Welcome to the sixth lesson. Today, we will focus on the current problems of the European integration. Let's start. Problems with the Union's institutional and political setup have come dramatically to the fore in recent years. Precisely at the same time as the entry into force of the Lisbon Treaty, starting in 2009, the Union has been hit by a serious crisis which is still ongoing and which has severely tested its institutional and regulatory structure, highlighted the fragility of its legal construction, and shaken the very idea of an ever closer union. Three episodes in particular have contributed to this institutional and political crisis. The sovereign debt crisis in some countries, mainly in Southern Europe, the migratory crisis, which has also seen the countries of the Mediterranean area in the forefront, and the United Kingdom's request for withdrawal, the so-called Brexit, notified to the Union in March 2017. Between 2009 and 2010, there were budgetary imbalances in some EU countries, namely Greece, Ireland and Portugal, and later also in Spain and Italy. These budgetary imbalances resulted essentially from high public debt accumulated over the previous decades. The main cause of these imbalances was the high interest rates needed to renew the bonds issued by these states to finance their public debt. In order to place their bonds on the market, high debt states, which were therefore considered to be at risk of default, had to offer a much higher interest rate than the other member states. The very popular so-called spread, that is to say, the difference between the interest rate on the bonds of the at-risk states and that on the bonds of the financially stronger state, for instance, Germany, well, this spread ended up being the unit of measure of the severity of the crisis. In particular, the states in financial difficulty invoked the principle of European solidarity and the adoption of debt collectivization mechanisms. The states with high financial guarantees invoke the principle of individual responsibility and the inability of the indebted states to implement effective forms of control over public budgets. The most acute phase of the crisis, which could have led to the insolvency of some states, for example Greece, was overcome through two types of measures. On the one hand, the most heavily indebted states received aid from the European Union and other international institutions. These aids, however, were under the conditions on the adoption of restrictive economic reform programs and on cuts in government budgets resulting in the impoverishment of the population. Heavy restrictions have also been placed on national competences in the field of economic policy, both through Union acts and through international agreements between member states, such as the now famous Fiscal Compact. On the other hand, the European Central Bank, acting at the limits of its competence, launched a program to buy the securities of indebted states on the secondary market, thereby reducing pressure on interest rates and bringing them back, at least temporarily, to sustainable conditions. The sense of solidarity between the member states was shaken to an even greater extent by the migration crisis triggered by the massive influx of migrants from the Middle East and North Africa, which began in 2015 and is still ongoing. These conflicts have caused the weakening of territorial control by state structures and the exodus of the civilian population from the theaters of conflict. The migration flow has been directed, for obvious geographical reasons, towards the Mediterranean countries and towards Greece and Italy. These countries were therefore called upon, to a large extent, to bear the social and economic burden of the migratory phenomenon. The crisis was managed and is still managed by the countries of arrival. The European Union decided to adopt two different strategies. On the one hand, European Union legislation on asylum seekers is based on the competence of the state of first arrival to deal with asylum applications. On the other hand, irregular migrants do not enjoy freedom of movement and, therefore, are destined to remain within the borders of the country of arrival until eventual deportation. These mechanisms, certainly not enough to cope with the emergency, have led to strong tensions between member states. Arriving states have called for mechanisms to redistribute migrants while other countries have opposed them. The migratory crisis has had a clear impact on public opinion to the extent that it has come into play in national political dynamics and has clearly influenced the political balance in favor of Eurosceptic parties. In order to limit this effect, member states and European institutions have tried to contain or stop the influx of migrants by closing the main routes into Europe. The main instrument of action is probably the joint statement of the European Union and Turkey of the 18th of March 2016, in which Turkey committed itself to stopping irregular migration across its borders in exchange for a series of countermeasures, including economic ones. Similar initiatives, however, conducted at state level with the support of the European Union also seem to be looming with respect to the Mediterranean route, which starts from Libyan ports and leads to Italy. The third event that we have to consider in order to understand the measure of the European process integration and its crisis is the United Kingdom's withdrawal. Indeed, in 2015, the United Kingdom government announced that it would hold a consultative referendum in which British citizens would vote to withdraw from or remain in the European Union. The prevailing opinion in political circles, supported by a series of polls, seemed to indicate a strong inclination of the British people not to question participation in the Union. Contrary to the expectations of political analysts, the referendum held on the 23rd of June 2016 gave, albeit by a narrow majority, an outcome in favor of the withdrawal. In March 2017, the United Kingdom then notified the Union institutions of its wish to withdraw under Article 50 of the Treaty on European Union. In May 2017, the Council adopted the negotiation directives, thus starting the negotiation process. Since the 31st of January 2020, the United Kingdom is no longer a member state. Although very different from each other, these three episodes have common features. They constitute as many points of emergence of a more general crisis of the project of European integration and are, let's say, rooted in the incompleteness of this project, the European integration project. After these three significant events, two more recent ones must be added: the COVID-19 pandemic and the war in Ukraine. In particular, COVID-19 pandemic accelerated fragmentations between societal groups and between places. It risks reinforcing existing imbalances and inequalities in the European Union. The worst and most direct impacts have been avoided by swift policy actions. In this context, cohesion policy played a role. This role consisted in the introduction of new measures to counteract the socio-economic effects of the pandemic, notably, among the others, the Recovery Fund system. However, cohesion policy might need to be adjusted due to complicating factors related to the complexity of local context, the diversity of policy interventions of individual member states, different deadlines, and, above all, the lack of appropriate data for analysis. Indeed, a cohesion policy reform should focus on addressing the underlying problems involving more strategic planning, fostering simplification, but with stricter controls when the corruption risk is high, increasing the interregional focus and exploring synergies with other European Union and national programs. The last event that we have to take into account is the tragedy that is still ongoing in Ukraine, the war in Ukraine. The war conflict in the East Ukraine impacts the geopolitical security and stability of Europe and other countries on the world. So, there are the global effects of the war conflict in Ukraine. And the instability in Ukraine has its social consequences that influences the European development. The social effects of the war in Ukraine are migration, unemployment, crime growth, decreasing of population, and many others. It has been described that the social dimension of the war conflict in Ukraine has its influence on European stability and geopolitical situation, especially related to the problems given by the Ukrainian migration and the rise in prices of essential goods, leading to subsequent inflation. As always, thank you for your kind attention.